Well, to the topic of COVID testing now, Nueces County Commissioner Brent Chesney says he's been getting questions about the test results. He says people were asking whether a person who tested positive for COVID-19 was being counted more than once after they were retested and found to still have it. Turns out the answer to that is no, they are only counted once. But Chesney says what he did find out was that private testing labs were sending only positive test results and were not necessarily including the negatives.
And I believe cumulatively over the period of time, we've underreported negatives in the thousands. And that's a lot, not a couple hundred. I believe it's a lot more than that. I don't have quantitative data.
And of course, that could affect what they call the positivity rate. But County Judge Barbara Canales says she also found that the negative results were not being reported as they should have. And she says they're now working with one of the largest labs in the area to correct that problem.